is ray tracing or RTX really worth it? At the moment, I remain unconvinced. Every game that I play, I tend to turn off ray tracing because I deem it not worth the frame rate hit. And visually, I think, it doesn't make much difference. But I am happy to be proved wrong. So today, we're going to be doing a blind test on F1 22 first, where I don't know which clip side by side has got ray tracing enabled and which one's got it disabled. Of course, if we can't tell it's enabled or not, there's no point it really existing. But if we can tell it's enabled, then maybe it is worth that frame rate hit. Let's get into it. All right, so starting here then with clip one. As I said, genuinely at the moment, no idea which one's got ray tracing. We've got 50 FPS or 60 FPS, sorry, limiter enabled. And other than that, like I said, both recording in 4K, no real differences. So they're both aboard the Ferrari. We're of course looking at all these around Monaco. These are very, very similar. My editor is really trying to trick me straight off the bat. So the lighting is where we should see a bigger difference. Now, it definitely is different there. The benchmark mode should be the same time of day at all times, and there was definitely some differences there. So I think one of these has got ray tracing. Honestly, right now, I have got no idea what the difference between these clips is. They're clearly different clips. Other than that, I've got no idea. They look very, very similar. I'm just going to pause it there so we can have a little look. I mean, if one of these has got ray tracing and one hasn't, it's not really worth it. I will say on the right-hand side here, in the distance, the shadows clearly go blurry. They clearly go blurry, whereas on the left, they stay really, really solid all throughout. Let's just go forward a little bit here, just a tiny little bit, so we can get the cars in the sun, which we've got here. So on our own car, again, we've got a real solid line on the left here of the shadow created by our halo. On the right side, it's a really, really soft line. If I had to guess, I would say they're both on high, and the left one's got ray tracing enabled. You know, the reflections on the Ferrari chassis and stuff all seems very similar. They are very similar for the most part. So let's find out the answer. Okay, all right. Super, super interesting. I was pretty close. I did identify that the left-hand one was ray tracing and the right-hand one was not ray tracing. But the left-hand one also had ultra settings, whereas the right-hand one only had high. And I was saying they were pretty similar. As I could barely tell the difference, both ultra and ray tracing aren't worth it. But let's move on to the second test. Okay, here we go then. Round two. Let's see if we can identify what's what. Now, I will say straight away, on the left-hand side there, looks certainly nice on the chassis, but it could just be the Red Bull livery is a bit more interested in the Haas one. So let's just keep playing this through. We may have identified a trick straight away in the first comparison by noticing that the shadows are a lot sharper with ray tracing, possibly. Again, though, I'm not seeing a massive difference. Looking at stuff in the background. Okay, once again, I'm just going to pause it here again because this is where we're able to tell for. So we've got a very similar shadow pattern here to last time. On the left-hand side there, it's much more defined going on. The right-hand side, it kind of gets blurrier earlier. I reckon the right-hand side is medium, no ray tracing. And the left-hand side is possibly medium with ray tracing. Again, not a huge difference between the two. Let's see what the results were. Okay, again. Again, I was very close. The right-hand side I got exactly right. Medium, no ray tracing. The left-hand side, though, I guessed medium with ray tracing. And we got the ray tracing part right. But again, we didn't get the high right. I honestly thought we'd see bigger differences between medium and high. I'm not going to lie. To be fair, on this poor screenshot at the end here, if you look at the barrier on the left, clearly you can see the one on the left has got much higher definition. The one on the right is just really grey and plain. The one on the left has got much better shadows. That could be both high or ray tracing. But again, I've been kind of surprised by them looking very similar, despite the ray tracing one also having an uplift in quality, you know, the preset setting, as well as having ray tracing enabled. All right, let's move on to the next one. Okay, here we go then with round three. So straight away, I'm saying the one on the right-hand side is a higher quality this time. That said, the one on the left has got way better reflections. Look at the reflections of the one on the left. But that could just be a gloss finish versus a matte finish. But clearly, the reflections on the chassis on the left are gnarly. Look at those. Again, oh God, this is so... Why I've made this so hard for myself. I do think, I'm going to stick with my initial instinct. I do think the one on the right has got a higher preset of graphic settings. So I reckon the one on the right is ultra, and I reckon the one on the left is high with ray tracing. And the reason I'm saying it's got ray tracing is because it's got really impressive reflections off the chassis. It could just well be a matte finish. That's why we're not seeing so many reflections, but we're just not seeing any. It's a really dull chassis. I don't know. I'm going to stick with it. Right-hand side is ultra, no ray tracing. Left-hand side is like high with ray tracing. Completely wrong again. Now, here's where things get interesting, okay? Because we've actually finally misidentified ray tracing, which is the core part of this video. I thought the right-hand side was high settings. It's only medium. That's a massive difference. Whereas the left-hand side was ultra settings, but no ray tracing. You know, clearly you can see with the screenshot at the end, we're seeing much more clearly defined shadows with ray tracing on. That's definitely a pattern now that we've been able to identify. You can clearly see ray tracing giving a lot more detail to the shadows on that sort of bendy barrier there. I'm being sold on ray tracing right now. Ray tracing, medium settings, but ray tracing enabled, versus ultra settings, no ray tracing. This is by far the most interesting test yet. Fascinating. I may have just been sold on ray tracing by that one comparison alone, but let's do the next test. Okay, here we go then. Comparison number 4. So, initial reaction, I'm going to give my reaction once again straight away. Pretty similar. Okay, again, I'm going to cheat a bit here. I'm going to use what we've learned. The one on the right is ray tracing, purely looking at the barriers. Looking at what the shadow does to the barriers up that hill, I'm pretty sure the one on the right is going to be ray tracing, which is this is why I want it to be a blind test. I didn't want to be able to cheat. So, the right or the right, I'm now 90% confident the right or the one on the right is ray tracing. If it's not, then, well, that'd be interesting. Both medium with the one on the right ray tracing. That's what I reckon. Neither of them look amazing, but also equally, they both look okay. But F1 is a good looking game. Maybe it's high. Might be high settings. Yes, I'm going to just go with my final thought. High settings, but the one on the right is ray tracing, the one on the left is not ray tracing. Both high settings. That's my guess. Let's get the results. Absolutely nailed it. Absolutely smashed it out of the park. That's the first one I've got exactly right, which again is partly because of the knowledge I've built up just over the course of this one video, but I've just nailed that. I will say, using the same graphic settings, ray tracing doesn't add that much, weirdly. The most interesting one for me so far is still that medium ray tracing versus ultra no ray tracing test. The previous test made me feel like, oh, ray tracing's way worth it. That one's muddied the waters again, because both on the same settings, it wasn't a massive difference. Looking at the still, you can see the difference. On the moving picture, though, I don't know if it was worth it. So we're going to do some performance analysis now then to figure out whether ray tracing is really worth the frame rate hit that you naturally take. So we're going to look at some static screenshots side by side to see the exact differences between ray tracing on and ray tracing off. And also we're going to look at the FPS differences between ray tracing on, ray tracing off, also the various different graphic settings, and try and figure out kind of an optimal graphic settings on F122. So I think it's important to point out then that we are only testing F122 today. Of course, that's because that's the game that I know the most about. But of course, different games are all optimized differently. They also all look a bit differently, so do just take these findings with a bit of a pinch of salt, and and just bear in mind that they will be different with every single game. I think it's also important to point out my computer specs as well. I'm running an NVIDIA RTX 4090, an AMD 7950X CPU, and then 64 gig of DDR5 RAM. So an incredibly powerful computer, which is how I'm able to run this game on absolute max settings in 4K and also record it. But with all that said then, guys, let's get into the comparisons. So just so we can establish a bit of a baseline here then, we're going to compare no ray tracing, but medium versus ultra settings, just to get a feel for what the differences in the game will be without getting ray tracing involved at all, just to get a general indication. Now, the frame rates of these are 250 FPS on medium and 180 FPS with ultra. So a decent frame rate here, not an insignificant one at all. But to be honest, the visuals aren't that different, really. The main one I noticed was the reflection on the car, on the top of the chassis there, where you get no reflections at all, really, on mediums, but you get a pretty significant, although ultimately blurry, reflection on ultra settings. And it's just a generally slightly refined image. I mean, if you look at the Aramco barrier there, on the right-hand side, you get slightly higher texture on ultra compared to what you do on medium. There isn't a huge difference there. So with that in mind, we are just going to take the ultra setting moving forward and get into some ray tracing comparisons. So we're now going to compare the Ultra preset with no ray tracing versus the Ultra preset with Ultra ray tracing. So just to highlight a few bits around the image quite briefly, directly in front of us there on the track, you can see a big difference in the shadow there. I guess ray tracing is accurate. There must be some sort of frame or so on a roof. Ray tracing is accurately giving the shadow of that frame, whereas without ray tracing, the game's just giving it a box and not actually modeling the light correctly. I noticed also there's quite a lot more contrast in the image. If you look at the right hand side there, the fence, you can almost barely see the fence without ray tracing. With ray tracing though, the fence is much more pronounced. I guess maybe just light reflections there, not too sure. Speaking of reflections, have a little look on the car itself. So the reflections on the main chassis don't seem to change too much, but if you look at the reflections on top of the side pods and also on top of the sort of little wheel arches, you get a massive difference there. There's no reflection at all without ray tracing. With ray tracing, you can really see things like the wing mirrors being reflected off the body, and it just looks a whole lot more real and a whole lot more dynamic, to be honest. Quite a significant difference across the whole image, I'd say, and a decent uplift in visual quality. but we also do take quite a significant hit on the frame rate. Without ray tracing, we're getting 180 FPS. With ray tracing, we're getting 60 FPS. So that's a third of the frame rate, which, to be honest, is too much. I mean, obviously, I'm running at a 4090 here. For most people, though, that's just too much of a hit. You know, it does look nice. It is too much. So we need to try and work on the optimization on that, try and get it to look similar to this, ideally, but with much better FPS. Now I'm going to set a target of 120 FPS at 4K, which is what I normally play on before I enabled ray tracing. So we'll have a look, do a few little tests here to see if we can get it somewhere near that. So in F122, you can actually choose 4 different aspects of turning ray tracing on and off. Now I noticed when you switch off the reflection option, it makes quite a significant difference to the frame rate. We go from 60 FPS with ray trace reflections on to 95 FPS with no ray trace reflections. That's a 50% increase in frame rate, which is pretty significant. But you can see we lose almost all the detail that's reflecting off the chassis of the car, particularly on top of the side pods there and also on top of the wheel arches. Those really nice reflections that we had before, they're all just gone. So you can clearly see why it's given us so much more frame rate, because clearly there's a lot of detail there that's just not being represented. So we are going to stick with this just to try and get up to that 120 FPS target. So the next thing we did then was we reduced the quality of the ray tracing. So we're sticking with no reflections. We've gone from ultra ray tracing quality down to medium ray tracing quality. Now visually, you can see there's not much difference between the two images at all. I mean, the crowd moving is the most significant one. But other than that, you know, it's actually really hard to see differences. If you look closely at the shadows though, you can just see them moving very, very slightly. And the frame rate difference we end up getting, we go from 95 FPS with the ultra ray tracing setting up to 130 FPS with the medium ray tracing setting. So again, that's another approximately 30% increase for this with very little visual difference, to be honest. That is well worth it. So we now reach our target of getting 120 FPS on 4K. We're going to compare those settings that we just found. So that's ultra preset with medium ray tracing, but reflections turned off, ray trace reflections turned off, versus ultra preset with no ray tracing at all. And actually, if you look at the difference between these two images, it's pretty significant. I think if I didn't just run you through there each step of us losing a bit of quality each time, you'd probably say, oh, that's a pretty decent step up. Because once again, we still maintain a lot of the differences. The barrier on the left there gets a bit more detail. Over on the right hand side there, that little lane bit there, you know, completely loses its light. Underneath the Aramco barrier, we lose that little strip, which probably shouldn't be lit. The building in the background gets much sharper lines. The shadow of the wheel, again, much sharper. So that is a pretty decent step up. I'm still a bit annoyed that we don't get the reflected ray tracing, because they do look really good, but I think the frame rate hit is just too much. So I think that is worth it. I've got to say, I mean, the frame rate difference in these two clips, we go from 180 FPS without ray tracing down to 130 FPS with ray tracing. And to me, that's pretty good. That's not a significant drop off. You know, I was thinking ray tracing always sort of halved your FPS, but that's not too bad, to be honest. To me, I actually think that is worth it. I think it's worth keeping ray tracing on in that situation. Now, one thing I haven't touched on yet, which we'll just touch on very briefly, is the power consumption. Of course, a big thing with an RTX 4090. I bet probably half of you watching heard I got a 4090 thought, oh god, he's paid a bit of energy bills then. I found that when I wasn't capping my FPS, the power consumption was largely similar. Every single test I did was between 360 watts and 430 watts. I will say ray tracing tended to add maybe up to sort of 50 watts or so to that, but that's pretty much the peak of the graphics card, because I'm just asking it to try as hard as it can. When I limited it down to 120 FPS, I saw a much more acceptable 200 watts consumption on the graphics card. I will say these are figures got directly from the graphics card itself. I wasn't able to measure it independently, but I think they're accurate enough just to take them with a bit of a pinch of salt. And then even further, if we limit it down to 60 FPS, we see a similar sort of drop off, pretty much as you'd expect, to be honest. And once again, we're seeing ray tracing add maybe 40 watts or so for the most part. Again, quite a significant difference between the medium and the on the medium preset with ray tracing enabled versus not enabled. But again, you know, could be an optimization in the game. I'm not really too sure. So if you are concerned about power consumption, frame rate limiter is definitely your friend. Limit it to, you know, whatever your monitor can handle, or even lower than that if you're particularly concerned about power consumption. So will I be running ray tracing for my streams and videos in the future? I've got to say, I have been fairly won over by ray tracing. I wasn't massively won over when I saw the blind comparisons, but having looked at the screenshots, I can clearly see, because they're identical screenshots, I can clearly see the benefit of ray tracing, and I do believe it does offer quite a significant uplift, and more of an uplift on medium versus ultra. For you guys, I would say it depends what you're looking for. If you're worried about power consumption, then limit your FPS and don't use ray tracing and use lower settings. If you want the game to look as beautiful as possible, probably do switch on ray tracing before you increase your graphics settings. Obviously, you know, FPS to me is always a priority. You'll have a target of what you want to get FPS wise. Is it 60? Is it 120? Is it 140? Is it 240? Whatever it may be. If that's the FPS you want to hit, stick to that. Enable ray tracing if you can. If you can't enable ray tracing, get to the target. Honestly, it's not worth it because it is a hit to the frame rate, but it will look quite a lot better. Anyway, guys, do let me know down in the comments what you thought of these tests and the difference between the screenshots. Maybe you guys noticed some things that I didn't. Maybe you guys had a completely different conclusion to me and decided, actually, no, Alex, there's no way that's worth it. But definitely let me know down in the comments, guys. And then don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We've got lots more content like this coming very, very soon. And I'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.